Your villain can make or break your story, because every protagonist needs a worthy opponent, someone who keeps the reader on edge and builds tension with their every action. But if your story feels a little flat, predictable, with low tension, there is most likely a problem with your villain, because a weak opposing force kills momentum, stakes, and the emotional payoff for your story. So, here's how to make your villain truly compelling. Hi, it's Simkray, and welcome to the third episode of Krayon Quest, a series where I share my own tips and tricks on how to create your own webcomics. Now, whether you're aiming for a villain, a rival, or something more abstract, your opposing force controls the pace and tension of your entire story. They quite literally decide how intense your scenes feel, how high the stakes can climb, and how much pressure your protagonist is under. So don't treat your villain like an afterthought, because they're basically half the story.
Part 1. What makes a great villain?
Most beginner writers think writing a villain is just about making someone do evil things. A little random violence there, some over-the-top edgy cruelty here, and a bit of destruction for no real reason but aura farming here. And don't get me wrong, those can work if handled correctly, but on their own, they usually don't. Because when a villain is always explosive, that's when they become predictable. You know they're gonna unalive someone. You know they're gonna snap. You know they're gonna evil monologue. And that predictability kills tension. They start feeling more like an inconvenience rather than a force to be reckoned with. And real fare for your readers comes from not knowing what your villain will do.
Part 2. Villain versus antagonist. What's the distinction?
Now, while the terms villain and antagonist are often used interchangeably, I personally feel like there's a subtle distinction between the two, and understanding the difference will instantly upgrade your storytelling.
What is a villain?
Traditionally, a villain is the negative driving force for the story, often motivated by a selfish desire for power, revenge, greed, control, or some kind of obsession. Their presence creates a constant sense of pressure. Even when they're not seen, you can still feel them looming, like a domineering force. And their name alone is enough to shift the mood of a room and have everyone shook. They represent a direct threat to the world, society, or the protagonist's core values, because if they succeed, everything falls apart. And that's what forces the hero or your main character into action.
Now, on the other hand, what is an antagonist?
An antagonist is anything that stands in the way of the protagonist's goal. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a person. It can be something abstract like fate, a prophecy, an illness, a natural disaster, or the protagonist's own fear, trauma, or self-doubt. In these cases, the conflict becomes psychological, emotional, or philosophical rather than just being physical. And that can open up way more storytelling depth and possibilities.
Sympathetic versus neutral antagonists.
You see, unlike villains, antagonists don't need to be the bad guy. They can be neutral, sympathetic, morally grey, even understandable at times. Think L from Death Note. He's not a villain at all, but he is absolutely the antagonist to light. Same with characters like Sai from Peach Girl. They oppose the protagonist, but that doesn't automatically make them evil. I mean, that's kind of debatable with Sai. She was actually just scum of the earth. And this kind of conflict often creates far more emotional complexity than simple good versus evil storytelling. So before you design your opposing force, ask yourself, does your story need a villain, aka a looming destructive force that needs to be stopped because the consequences of letting the villain do what villains do would be catastrophic, or an antagonist, aka a layered obstacle that creates emotional and psychological pressure for your protagonist? Because your answer will completely change the pacing, tone, themes, and the emotional weight of your story. And choosing the right one will make your story feel more intentional. Once you understand this difference, designing powerful and interesting antagonists or villains becomes a lot easier. At least from my experience.
Part 3. Backstories.
Here's the uncomfortable truth. Interesting villains don't think they're evil. They think they're the good guy. So their logic should make sense even if their actions don't. And when the audience can understand the villain's reasoning, that's when things get a little more interesting. Because now your readers don't just fear them. They can kind of almost see things from their point of view. And when it comes to writing your villain's backstory, your goal is not to justify their behavior, it's to explain it. Questions like what events shaped them, what did they lose, who betrayed them, and or what moment changed their worldview. Their backstory should act like a psychological blueprint, showing us how they became this person, without asking the reader to forgive them. Remember, if you have to have an explanation for something, it should be used to create understanding. The moment you dip into justification, that weakens the impact. And good villains live in that uncomfortable, morally grey middle ground.
Part 4. Morality.
A villain who is only ever presented as being evil will always be limited and predictable, because once you lock them into that box, you remove your ability to add nuance later. That's how you end up with a one-dimensional villain with no wiggle room for growth or change. But when your villain has some kind of moral code, moments of restraint, glimpses of kindness, or even emotional contradiction, you unlock that flexibility. Because now the reader starts wondering,
my sweet baby boy villain, is this still hope for them?
And once you plant that seed, you gain emotional leverage. Because now you can play with and manipulate expectations, create doubt, and deliver devastating payoffs.
My favorite thing to do.
Not by adding sudden scenes that don't fit the character or are just completely out of character, but by making your villain feel and act like a real person from the jump, who sometimes makes horrific choices. Humans are messy and complicated like that. But a great tip is to give them a belief system. Not just a goal, but some kind of philosophy that they can stand by. Like, what do they generally believe about the world they live in, its people, politics, justice, and make them act consistently within that belief.
Part 5. Weaknesses. Because power without limits is boring.
This one is especially important for fantasy-based stories, but something you should keep in mind when creating your villain is to not make them so overpowered to the point where you end up writing yourself into a dead end. This goes for any character really, but for your villain specifically, nothing kills tension or people's sense of disbelief faster than suddenly pulling a deus machina out of nowhere. Even strong villains need vulnerabilities, whether physical or psychological, as these weaknesses create opportunities for growth, conflict, or redemption, while also giving your protagonist believable ways to win.
Perspective shift.
And if you're someone who really struggles with writing flaws or weaknesses, it usually means you're seeing them as limitations.
I mean, they kind of are for the characters you're writing.
But as a writer, ironically, the more flaws your villain has, the more creative freedom you gain. Because now you have to come up with creative ways your villain can overcome their flaws or weaknesses, instead of them just doing whatever they want whenever they want with no repercussions. Basically, it forces you to be smarter.
In conclusion,
So, if you want to write villains that are actually compelling, make them people first. Make their actions intentional. Make them write in ways that feel a bit uncomfortable. Anyway, whether you're writing villains, protagonists, or entire story worlds, I've got loads more content coming, so be sure to follow for more.
If you're into that kind of thing.
And if you've made it this far, let me know in the comments what topics you'd like me to cover in this series.
Cheerio. Okay, thanks.
I hope you guys realize that I recorded this video, re-recorded this video several times, mainly because my last video about protagonist was a bit rambly. Nobody said it was rambly, but I personally feel like it was a bit rambly. So I tried to make this one a bit more concise while still trying to make it interesting. So hopefully that makes sense. That's it. Bye.